So in this video, I wanted to show a system of fully magnetic modular grass that I've developed that can not only blend ugly square tile corners into any shape that you want, like Lego, but can also create organic looking tesselatable shapes perfect for patchier grass areas, and will even blend smoothly with magnetic patches of other terrain that I've planned for the future. Welcome to the archive. My name's Matt. Future Matt here, because although this system technically works perfectly and I think looks amazing, I discovered several things that needed reworking along the way. Not only this, but towards the end of my work on the project after this one, which uses this system as well, I slowly realised that it had a fatal flaw for its intended purpose.
That is one big pile of shit.
But I have also figured out a solution/alternative so that you guys can have a smooth time from the outset. I have left most of this video intact, albeit with updated comments on how to avoid problems, because the system shown here does work and is still great for showing small ground texture patches scattered in the middle of an open area. Or for highly intricate modular dioramas. I know some of you guys are diorama builders. That said, I will pop up again at the end of this video to describe in more detail the problem that I discovered with this system, as well as the new shapes that I've ended up using instead, which are a lot easier and basically replace it. Now, I've shown magnetic grass tufts before, but what I've done here is a little different. I'm aiming to make larger tufts here, with the magnets sealed in at the creation stage, the goal being to keep the tufts as smooth with the dirt as possible, allowing them to blend the sharp edges of grass tiles into something more natural looking, without needing tons of specific tiles. These tufts all work with the magnetic dirt tiles method that I showed recently, so if you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend it. A lot of experimentation led me to landing on these shapes, which can be combined in a wide range of different ways, like grassy Lego, to make sloped corners in a range of angles, which adds far more potential for variety when laying down grass tiles and really helps avoid the repeating tile look. For example, you can make a convex corner around a half tile with these half corners, or around a full tile with these full corners. Both of these line up with the straight edge pieces because they all stick out 3/4 of an inch from the tile. Then you can make a half concave corner by using the 3/4 inch corner and 2 of the 3/4 inch square strips. These then line up with the straight edge pieces like this. Or you can do a full corner by using 2 half corners touching the edges of the straight pieces and fill the gap with more squared filler pieces. Final example, you can do an interesting double-length gentle corner by using a full strip, then 2 half strips, followed by a half strip pointed the other way. Again, these line up with the straight edge pieces, and the inner gap just gets filled with more square tiles. What's great about these corners is you can use the same shapes for as many convex or concave corners as you need. And you can vary the angle from long and gentle to short and harsh without needing a ton of very specific tiles. Future Matt here. So some have pointed out to me that I may have gone a little bit overboard with the Lego level modularity here.
Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
So I created a few simpler corner topper shapes, which you can use instead if the Lego thing seems like a bit much. There's a 3x3 corner and a 1.5 inch corner for a tighter corner around buildings. The basic 3x3 convex corner works really well with just these corner strips, so I kind of left that as it is. I do still recommend making these edge strips, because on their own they're great for the edges of buildings, among other things. So hopefully that's a bit easier. These corners can also be used along straight edges, but as I mentioned, I've also put together some 3 inch and 1.5 inch straight pieces, which add a lot more variety. But more importantly, the 3 inch pieces are designed to merge into my favourite new shape, what I call the ooze, my organic aperiodic monotile. I got this idea when searching for an organic looking shape that it could also tile together reasonably well, and while searching I came across the recently discovered aperiodic monotile, the Einstein hat. It doesn't actually have anything to do with Einstein or hats, and I'm kind of convinced they're trying to confuse future generations here, but I digress. The hat itself is actually made up of multiple kites, and is one in a whole series of shapes that are aperiodic monotiles, shapes that can connect together in an infinite but non-repeating pattern. There are some caveats in here, not least of which being that inverting the shape is needed in certain places, but people kept working on it, and after the hat proved difficult to get as organic as I wanted, I searched further and came across the spectre. This is basically the middle point in that series of shapes, but with its edges curved in an identical manner throughout. Now this one had potential. I took this piece and rounded off its sharp tips carefully, and got closer still to what I wanted, but I found that this shape could repeat patterns, unlike the hat, which kind of led to it looking a little less than organic. It also wasn't made up of kites like the hat, which further limited its modularity. Finally, I took the hat and, with help from a patron, applied the curved edges method to it and its component kites instead. Voila! A true organic aperiodic monotile. Kind of. It will leave tiny connecting gaps at the tips, but for our purposes with grass, that really doesn't matter. Now, the really cool thing about this is not only does it fit together in a wide range of organic looking shapes, it is also made up of a series of warped kites, in the same way that the hat was made up of straight kites. We can take these kites and make smaller shapes that we can slap on the edges, fill gaps, and generally use to edit the shape to our heart's content. On top of this, we can of course create larger shapes by combining several oozes into a larger ooze. See why I called it that now? Which can be used to quickly lay out a larger shape to add to, or to fit on larger scatter terrain features like plaster rocks and rubble. Future mat again. After some use and feedback, I reworked this slightly. All the pieces are pretty much the same, I just made the core piece that we use larger. I call this shape the heart because it kind of looks like one, and then I use oozes and bikites to wibble the edge and make the shapes less repeated. Hearts can connect to other hearts, but they won't perfectly tessellate like the oozes do. I find that this works fine in its final intended form because these pieces aren't really meant to fully cover an area anyway, more create patches of texture and blend into others. Single kites are still usable, but honestly in most situations leaving a single kite space open looks fine anyway, and just gives you another spot to drop magnetic scatter terrain into. Now, as mentioned, the straight edge strips allow us to merge the ooze tiles and smaller ooze kite tiles into an area of square grass along a straight line. But if we want to merge it into a corner or Z shape, we're going to need some other pieces, namely this one and this one, as shown here on my crude experimental diagram. Now, you might be asking, why not just use the corner Lego grass that you showed earlier to blend the grass in? Well, I have plans in future for these ooze shapes. Eventually, this grass will be blending into a lot more than just the dirt beneath it. Plus, using the oozes gives a much more chaotic edge, which I think looks better in wild areas. Finally, as you can see here, because these shapes are made of kites, that means you can make hexagons and half hexagons to fill these spaces, for which I have made some templates, though I haven't tested these myself. However, this won't work as well for future textures that I have planned for this system. Grass can merge together into one blob, but not all textures will do that, and the shape within those textures will be important at some point. Back to the tufts. I made these on parchment paper, which in turn I used double-sided tape to attach to these sturdier transparent printable sheets, which helps keep the surface flat when drying instead of warping and crinkling. I found attaching the double-sided tape worked best when I lined up the bottom and top along the edge before lowering the end down slowly and then smoothing it out. From there I could lower the next piece down the exact same. Don't worry too much about perfect alignment. The goal is to get them ideally within 1mm or so of each other, just so we don't end up with any ripples. It's fine to have the tape overlap a bit at the end, because you can easily line this up with a ruler and just slice it off. Then once I had most of the piece covered, I uncovered one tape at a time and stuck the parchment paper down, with the glossier, easy peel side of the parchment paper facing up. I found it easier to line up the first tape by laying out the sheet over the other tapes and lining up the top and bottom edges, then doing each tape in turn after that the other way. Once done, the other side will probably have some tape sticking out, which, like mentioned, you can trim off with a ruler again. You can also do this with the flappy sides where the paper overlaps the tape, to avoid it pulling loose too easily. These will get a little dirty after use, and over repeated use the parchment paper will get micro crinkles which will make removing tufts harder. Luckily, you can just remove the parchment paper carefully and lay out a fresh one. The tape keeps its stickiness remarkably well. I'd also recommend not using the last inner stretch of a roll of parchment paper for this, as it tends to be quite crinkled, and that's kind of defeating the object of what we're trying to do here. It adds a ton of bubbles and kind of ruins the point. To mark out my tuft shapes and make life easier, I made and printed these sheets, which you guys can download and use too. There's a corner blending sheet and a square/rectangle grid to go with it. These are actually slightly smaller than the space they're designed to fit in. This lets them fit together easier without being accidentally too large. Then there are the ooze tiles and kites, which as mentioned can be used to fill up gaps or edit the shape as needed. Finally, there's a much larger 8 ooze shape that tessellates with itself perfectly that can be used to lay out for much larger areas with single oozes usable to wibble up the edges. Oh, and you can use the road tile templates I made ages ago to make some patches to turn any dirt tiles into more roads. Before I get into the handcrafting method I used for these original toppers, you can actually use a cricut or equivalent to cut these pieces using the acrylic setting. I made PNG files compatible with the Joy Extra or larger on top of the other templates, so you can just plug and play those, which vastly cuts down on your cutting time. Bonus tip, when a cutting mat starts to lose its stick, you can actually paste it with a thin layer of tuft glue to give it that stick back, which actually makes the mats last for far longer. To get the shapes to apply glue to, I first glued a printable transparent sheet to the paper using a glue stick. It's important here to cover the whole surface of the sheet before applying, and to apply glue to the plastic, not the paper, to avoid warping before you combine them, aiming to smooth them out and avoid bubbles. Next, I applied another transparent sheet over the top, this time adding just half as much glue in strips because the plastic won't warp. I tried adding more layers than this, but I found that cutting through any more than 2 layers at once was more trouble than it was worth and caused inaccuracies. The glue stick glue itself won't dry, and that's fine. The wide surface holds the sheets in place while we cut. It's important to keep the shape attached to the larger sheet on at least a small section until the majority is cut out accurately with a knife. I also cut out a rather patriotic shape from the middle. This reduces quite how rigid it can be, but retains some strength for easy placement, and allows them to more easily bend over curved shapes like steep hills, which are planned in dirt form at some point. No matter how patriotic you may be feeling, I do recommend that you Yanks use the same pattern. Your stars and stripes won't have quite the same effect. Future mat again. I now don't actually recommend cutting these gaps into these shapes. I actually found out during use that they leave fairly obvious moisture stains if left on the dirt tiles for too long. I tried a bunch of things to counter this effect, and while a layer of basing glue and dirt grout mix sealed them somewhat, I did another experiment where I left them out for about a week, and even then about half of the tiles still had issues with the moisture staining, so not ideal. So just to avoid the risk at this point, I would say just don't bother cutting these gaps in the middle of the tiles. The advantage of this is it makes peeling them a hell of a lot easier because they're not actually sticking to the paper. They're still fairly flexible, enough for some sort of gentle hills, but not quite as much as I'd originally intended. It's not ideal, but it works well enough. Once both layers are cut out, I dunk them in water for a minute or so and wash off the glue and let them dry. There are several template sheets you can do this with, and 2 batches of each sheet with double layered film on each gives a solid amount of each shape, though 1 batch of each would probably be fine to start with. I layered these final shapes over the parchment paper we prepared earlier and over a magnetic surface. While this will work with magnetic sheet like this, I preferred this magnetic steel sheet that I bought for pinning maps and overlays to for campaigns. Very useful and a lot stronger. For the base of the tufts, I originally used Geek Gaming basing glue, but unfortunately it seems like they've changed their old formula over a year ago now, and the old glue that I had no longer exists. The new basing glue is completely different stuff with different properties. Luckily, World Scenics now makes a tuft glue that is pretty close to the original properties of the Geek Gaming basing glue. It does take twice as long to dry. You want to leave it at least a full 24 hours, if not a full 48 hours to cure properly. But this actually kind of works out for us because it gives us more working time when actually applying the glue. I talk a lot more about these types of glue and my search for the replacements that I found in the video updates that I do for every project. I release these every 2 weeks-ish while working on a project for patrons, so if you want to hear more of my ramblings and details about how projects come along and come to be, well, that's where you can find them. Fair warning, Woodland Scenics Tuft Glue and their flashier, slightly cringe-inducing wargaming branded version.
You're not into all that stuff your old man's into, right?
How do you do, fellow kids?
Is not the same stuff and is not ideal for this project. Plus, it's about 50% more expensive. I added 2x1mm magnets along the edges and added a dab of basing glue before each one in order to grip the magnet in place when applying more glue later, so we don't need to worry about nudging them. I used basing glue, not tuft glue for this part specifically because it dries faster. We don't need flexibility, and for this use we actually don't want it to stay sticky. This also isn't essential. You can leave them held in place by magnetism if you're careful later. But aside from making adding the glue easier, this also let me slide them from a small steel sheet to a large steel sheet once they were done, which helps with doing lots of batches at once. I deliberately chose weak, cheaper magnets as it allows them to hold but be relatively easy to remove without damaging anything. It's also cheaper to line the edges of the piece this way, which means you get less floaty areas at the edges and the piece looks more like a natural part of the tile. This is where I put magnets on the various pieces. I did use stronger 4x1mm magnets on the smallest squares and circles, mainly to make them a little easier to make. You want to make doubly sure that the ooze, kite and 3-inch straight edge pieces are the same side up as they are on the printed sheet. They're not reversible. The other pieces are though. I also cut some discs slightly larger than my largest tree base and used this alternative template to cut out the middle of the piece. This gives a nice hole in the middle for placing trees and other accessories later. Future Matt here. I tweaked this a bit after use. The templates now use slightly wibbled shapes. The big ones I call blooms because they look a bit like flowers, and the smaller ones I call tufts because, well, they're basically tufts. Using this shape instead of a circle provides a longer stretch of relatively straight texture to connect them to other pieces or each other in a haphazard manner if needs be, and also makes them a little less obviously a perfect circle. I use these combined with bikites to fill tighter areas like ravines or narrow overhangs. It lets you fill them up far more easily than trying to use the larger shapes. The key here is not worrying about small gaps. The textures we're using here look fine with little bits of mud poking through. The main thing is to connect as many as you can. You can even leave the middle of the tight space as mud to show a path. And of course the gaps in the oozes and hearts can be filled with various scattered pieces instead. You also want to put magnets around the edges of this ring when placing them at a later stage. I also grassed up a batch of these discs separately to fit in the holes when not being used by trees. If you've made magnetic trees already, like I have following the original design that I put out there with 6x4mm magnets, I'd recommend making a little, mostly flat dirt mound circle by using green stuff over a 10x2mm magnet, with basing glue and dirt over that. This is because I've added an update note in the archive index on Patreon to recommend using 10x4mm magnets or double stacked 10x2mm magnets for trees these days for the added strength. I made these trees before discovering these beastly magnets, so the dirt mound helps make up for the extra strength for larger, heavier trees. Small ones should be just fine on the magnetic dirt with the original magnets. You can also still add a magnet hole at any point under the tile, but that limits placement, which defeats kind of half the point of this modular dirt and grass system. I have more plans to fit these holes upcoming, but that probably doesn't surprise anyone. Future Matt again for hopefully the final time. I have now updated the design of these trees. There is an STL version, which I am using in the upcoming forest video, that has been released to patrons and will come back as a throwback for patrons over time at some point. However, there is also a crafted version that I am working on. It's not going to release immediately, but I am trying to get it released at some point within this year. So if you're planning on making these yourself, just so you know, there is an updated crafted version coming and an STL version that you can get your hands on through Patreon if that's kind of something you'd prefer to do. Speaking of STLs, to thank everyone for being patient again, I've added a bonus throwback for patrons this month, so you can pick up this Town and Village scatter pack, as well as these farm village accessories, including the magnetic fences from the dirt tile video, alongside this month's actual release, which I'm kind of working on right now. It should be a set of authentically medieval feeling scatter terrain for a logging camp, including magnetization slots for climbing minis. On the larger ooze tiles, I also added a few patches of plaster rocks, placing them with a layer of basing glue well before adding the tough glue, just to secure them in advance. I peeled the piece up here once dry and added some fresh printable transparent sheet because superglue won't stick to it, and superglued some arid earth in place around the rocks. Usually I just let it fall where it may, but this time we needed to keep it within the lines, so I brushed up any that went too far before applying the glue. I removed the sheet again once the superglue dried. Anyway, the grass. I added tuft glue to the template direct from the bottle in a line that I dragged out over the edge of the template. I found it was better to do this around the edge first thickly like this, as I could nudge the glue with the bottle as I went to push it right up to the edge of the template. The glue is fairly thick, so generally speaking it's quite good at not overflowing the edge. Then I just filled in the middle, except for the dirt-covered discs. It's generally a good idea to aim for thick glue across the whole piece, as thin pieces can tear on removal or later in use. When applying the glue, if you find you go over the edges, you can pick the glue back off the surface with a wet brush if there's a lot. Just wipe off the glue each time and wet the brush again before going back for more. Alternatively, if there isn't much overlap, you can use a cocktail stick to slice the blob off from the main piece, which should tear off neatly later even if it does get grassed on the paper. Finally, I used that brush to poke any areas that didn't quite get properly covered in glue at the edges. I found it was easier to do less at a time. I did half an A4 sheet at once, and then that half I did in 2 stages. Basically doing a quarter of the sheet at once, and then cleaning up any overlap, touching up with the brush, and then doing the other quarter before adding the grass and dirt. The less you do at once, the easier it is, but the longer it takes. So take on as much challenge as you feel comfortable with. While the glue is wet, add the grass you want. I experimented doing this differently to the original grass tile to try and avoid having to use the enamel car varnish that I used to add the second layer of grass previously. Instead, this time I tried mixing the 2 grass types I used in 2 layers previously, as the main reason to keep them separate was to have patches of different tinted grass. That was great for Luke's original method where he used it on large boards, but I really didn't use it on my tiles, especially smaller ones, because it doesn't work so well with modularity and square corners. To counter the loss of the 2-layer effect, I added some 2mm dead grass to the mix, which will naturally fall further down and give us that dead-looking underlayer. But I balanced the overall green grass with tan dead grass, so the overall mix was 2 parts autumn green 4-6mm to 1 part dead 4-6mm and 1 part dead 2mm. I've also shown on Patreon how to mix this dead grass mix yourself, as Geek Gaming changed their mix to this more green tinted one. Mixing your own grass isn't for everyone obviously, so if you prefer, you might get a similar result by using 1 part autumn green instead of 2 parts autumn green, but I can't guarantee this. I also decided to try out a more powerful static grass machine. To see if it was worth it. I think so, but I think the cheaper one I've used all along is perfectly usable too. I paid for this thing in full, so there's no bias here. If you are interested in my thoughts on it, I'll leave a link in the description to the Patreon update video where I talked about it in rambling detail. I found a few things helped when static grassing. First was using garden wire to bind up the crocodile clip wire and shorten it to a length where it could reach the bottom, but the wire couldn't fall into the glue or the grass. I also bound a length of wire into the jaws of the crocodile clip, which made aiming the static grass connection where I wanted it to go much easier. Finally, I found grassing groups of pieces easier if I pointed the grasser angled away from the glued pieces that I wasn't grassing yet, which avoids them getting a bunch of flat grass dropped on them with no static charge before you actually reach them. I generally tipped this grass off, then went back over in the other direction and angle, filling any gaps on the other side and maximizing coverage. This new single layer mix means that all the grass is sealed into the tuft glue, which is far stronger than relying on the varnish or scenic sealant, and also means that the piece doesn't even really need sealing due to the sheer strength of the basing glue hold. What it does need, as always, is a sprinkling of grout to de-stick the basing glue and make it more like flexible dirt. I also used a stick to muss up the grass a bit, because the raw power of the new grasser made the grass a bit of a uniform carpet when laid out en masse. Overall, this is a much easier and stronger grass method, and is probably how I'll be doing grass tiles going forwards. For sheer strength, it's so much better. It needs half as many layers doing, so it's faster, and there's no need to fill a room with toxic enamel varnish or even spend time sealing afterwards. And as you can see, storage is easy because you can stick them back to back and then stack them. You can even add magnetic sheet to card and place the first tuft magnets down. The stacked tufts will then hold in place on top of it like Velcro. I left these to dry for over 24 hours, which was usually enough. You can check to see if there's any white still visible by pulling the paper off the magnetic sheet. The edges should be dry enough to hold everything in place. Peeling is a careful procedure. You want some dirt mix on your fingers to de-stick the glue as it becomes exposed, and any pieces that are extra tacky, you can sprinkle some dirt into so it seals as it reveals. Either way, peel slowly, pulling gently with your dirt fingers close to the connection to the paper, which helps avoid stretching and tearing. Now, this is where I need to include a warning. When I say you want to add dirt to the bottom of the tiles to de-stick them, I cannot overemphasize how important doing this stage thoroughly is, because I found out partway through recording footage that if you only de-stick the glue but don't bother properly sealing it with dirt grout, then it can end up leaving a moisture stain. This stain does seem to go down over time, but it's not as simple as hair drying it away. It does seem to stop drying when still partially visible on these tiles, albeit much less so. Adding dirt to the bottom of tiles reduces it enough that it isn't really noticeable in most natural light or indoor light conditions, but it does still show under my glaring studio lights. For most people, this should be enough, but if you didn't want to risk it, you can just not cut the Union flag shape into the underside, which reduces flexibility for use on hills, but otherwise is pretty similar in how it works in every other aspect. Another potential solution is simply adding more scenic sealant to the dirt tiles until the dirt looks wet, the idea being it can't get stained wet if it already looks wet. Anyway. Finally, you can even make full 3-inch or 6-inch grass toppers instead of normal grass tiles. These are much lighter than tiles and can be stored stacked like this, which lets you store far more options for your tiles in far less space. I made these in the exact same way as the other pieces, just a different shape. You can use a 2x1mm magnet every 1.5 inches long, or you can use 4x1mm magnets every 3 inches instead for more grip. These fit smoothly on top of the magnetic dirt tiles, or even on top of magnetic floor tiles if you've seen that bonus video, which gives you some flexibility in how many grass to dirt tiles you have when you need them. You could make all of your grass tiles this way, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless storage space is your highest priority. I use these to add more grass when I need it, or to use other grass types in small areas for variety. Future Matt back again. So that is the system as it was originally designed, along with a few tweaks to make it function better. The problem is, in practice, the ooze pieces, even with the larger heart shapes, take way too long to lay out during gameplay in complex areas where it's not just one wide open patch of dirt or a narrow dirt ravine. This is mainly because, though you do learn how to connect the system and kind of get used to it, so to speak, it's still much more of a puzzle for the brain than I ever really intended it to be. It works, and it looks gorgeous. It's just not as practical as I intended for quickly laying out large complex areas like we use in our games. My solution for this is really what I probably should have done in the first place, and simply involves some interesting curved and straight pieces that can combine to make square pieces when needed, but can also connect together as different textures to allow for natural shaped edges. The edge piece and corners can also be used to edge off grass areas, so this version doesn't even need separate pieces for that. And one final piece works for both concave and convex corners for mountain blocks, giving you more flexibility with these pieces too, and making narrow ravines pretty easy to lay out. In terms of magnet placement, it's still 2x1mm for most of them placed like you can see here, with the exception being the mountain block pieces, which use some 4x1 at the edge for extra pull when used on convex corners and they need to slope down more. I aim to keep this version of the system simple, so currently it only has 3-inch square pieces, but you could in theory add more shapes like 3x6-inch or 1.5-inch square. The key is making sure that the wibble is exactly the same on all pieces of the same type. The method other than that is identical to the oozes that I just showed, which is why I didn't completely rework the video. The advice is still all fairly solid, you just need to use a different shape. The templates that I used for this simpler system, which I've been calling the Texture Topper System for clarity, or TT for short, are available on Patreon along with the other templates for the ooze system. I kept the ooze templates up partially to give people options, but mostly because the oozes are still kinda useful for placing smaller random patches of texture in open spaces, like in the middle of a village or a large camp. You just don't need to make all that many of them. Overall, I'm kinda sad that the ooze system didn't function as I intended it to. Overall, I think this new system will be more straightforward and enjoyable to use for most people, and should feel better to lay out. Please subscribe, like and comment, and if you haven't seen them yet, you might want to check out my city or sewer tile videos on the left here. But until next time, I'll be in the archive.